You can't think about the past in any position other than the one that you stand in when you're doing it. It's not just that it's an important component of how people, individuals, or groups remember. It's that it's the only way they remember. You can't remember otherwise. You don't get some objective, disembodied access to the past. We can only remember as human beings, and as human beings, we can only be socio-historically located. There's no other way to do it. It's the historiographical version of the same conversation about linguistics and interpretation. When we translate texts and stuff like that, yes, of course, some meaning gets lost, but it's also the only means by which any of it gets through. There's no evidence whatsoever that any of Jesus' disciples walked around like with notebooks taking notes on what he was doing. But even if they did, it would not have changed the fact that whatever got written down and whatever they processed and heard would have been necessarily impacted by their own socio-historical locations. In other words, who they are. They can only understand what was happening as themselves. For example, like the way Rembrandt paints biblical imagery, and they're all wearing clothes that would have been popular at the time of Rembrandt. That's not the way they dressed in the first century, right? So he's painting a picture of the past, but he necessarily thinks about it in his own terms. Despite what I just said, I don't think it's illegitimate to ask historical questions. I've written several books that ask and try to answer historical questions, but I think that the starting point is not, did this or did this not happen? The starting point is saying, why might they have thought this? And if you start there, then you have to start speculating in the best way possible, using your historical imagination, the various reasons they might have thought these things. Working through those proposed scenarios is how you can actually start making historical decisions. And there's no template to proving that something did or didn't happen. And like I said earlier, I think there's an awful lot in the Gospels that we can't possibly hope to get answers to. And then there are other things. I use the example of the Matthean zombies, which I don't think that really ever happened in real life, and I don't know any gospel scholars who do. But but if you're playing the zero-sum game, then what you say is that tells us nothing about the historical Jesus. And I think that I completely reject that idea. Because what it tells us is that already in the first century, whoever Matthew was, thought Jesus was, they thought that he kick-started the resurrection in some way that led to the resurrection of other people. And whether anybody accepts the resurrection or the claim of those restricted resurrections to be historically accurate, the very fact that they thought that, they claimed it, is a historical piece of evidence that we can investigate. Because we can say, well, why did they think that? And for me, part of the reason is they probably believed in Jesus' resurrection, but they also believed that he was the promised Messiah who was going to kickstart the end times. And so then you start asking, well, why did they think that? All right, and and then you can actually start answering questions about, well, what would have made them thought that? So I would come out the other end of that process saying, no, I don't actually think that people came up out of tombs at Jesus' crucifixion and were seen walking around Jerusalem. And we have one person who attests to that, one historical source about it. I mean, if that actually happened, then we have a lot more about that. But I do think the fact that they claim it tells us a whole lot about who they thought Jesus was. So in other words, instead of, the traditional scholarly thing is to take that piece of tradition and just throw it out like, oh, well, that's just early Christian belief. But all we have is early Christian belief. It's not like we have something else. That's what we have. So the question isn't, well, is this early Christian belief? The answer to that question is easy. It is. The question is, why did they believe that instead of believing something else? I mean, there's a historical Jesus scholar named Dale Allison that's got a fantastic piece on the Matthean zombies. And he articulates in a much better way what I kind of just said now. The fact that it didn't happen doesn't mean it tells us nothing historically. It tells us a lot historically. the earliest followers of Jesus, they did care about whether things really did happen. I mean, Paul says, if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, we'd be pitied among all men. And Paul, and whatever somebody does with the resurrection, I at least historically am really convinced they believed it. They didn't think they were hallucinating. They didn't think it was a group hallucination. They didn't think that. They didn't mean what we would say when we'd say, like, my grandma's with me in spirit. That's not what they were talking about. They really believed it. Now, does that prove that it's true? No. No more than, the people, people die for things they believe in all the time. But they did think it, all right? And Paul believed in it. He believed it was something very different than what we often think of. But, what I'm trying to say is the whole idea of asking the question, well, did this really happen? That has a place. The earliest followers of Jesus do care about that. What's difficult is they don't always care about it the way that we do. And what they did with their convictions was not always what we do. But if the earliest accounts of the first century Jesus followers are to be believed, I think that the very earliest of his followers, the closest of his followers, would necessarily have concluded that he was not who they thought he was initially. That's why they're huddled in a room. That's why they don't believe initially. That's why in the literature it takes Jesus showing them his body and eating with them to convince them. Is because they believe, the crucifixion was necessarily a statement that Jesus lost. It would have taken something powerful to make them change their tune on that. And so that's one way to get into the question about the resurrection the least we can say is that it would have taken an event like that, could they have had some type of mass deception or something like that? Absolutely. That could have happened. How do we prove that one way or another? There's no test to run on that. And similarly to the question that you're asking, whether, do we know, let's say that we shift saying, within a community of faith, let's shift to saying what really matters is not whether XYZ thing happened, but whether Jesus is who he says he is. All right? This is where the people, our detractors, I'm going to say but they actually have a leg to stand on, because can you answer that question without necessarily assuming the answer to some historical questions? Yeah, that's the case. I don't think that for people who want to claim to be Christians, you don't escape answering some historical questions. It's not the case that it's just all story and all the truth is in story. What is the case is you have no access to it other than story. Right? There is no history without interpretation. And similarly, the statement about if we shift from saying that what really matters not whether XYZ happened, but whether Jesus is who they say he is, whether that is accurate. How do you measure that? You measure it with your life. Within the church community, that's the answer. But whether whether it's true, you have students who say, I have students who would say, well, I know it's true because I know it in my heart. I know what's inside of me. I know what happened to me, and you can't know it if you didn't have it. I distinctly remember it was at Lincoln, I had a student, and I said, do you believe in alien abductions? He said, no. And I said, well, why wouldn't you? Because that's the exact explanation that people who claim to have been abducted by aliens give. I know what happened to me. I know what I experienced, and you don't understand it because you haven't experienced it. And the issue is that one of those things appears radical and one of them appears normal because one of them's been normalized within a faith community. Actually, the other one's been normalized within a faith community as well. They're just a minority community, even more minority than Christians. But the thing is, yes, you can appeal to that, and I'm not saying that it doesn't matter for anything. But I am saying that how you answer the question of whether that's ultimately true, I don't personally think. I mean, there are people who claim to have had, experiences of God. I would love to have one. I've never had one, but I'm open to being just, proven wrong on it. But I just don't think for the vast majority of us, certainly in the Western world where we tend to be anti-supernatural, even within a community that claims to believe in the supernatural, I just don't know that you get answers on this side. I've had many students and people I've talked to, they really don't like that. But I can tell you a lot of times when we talk to broken people, particularly within the faith community, and they know that life isn't exactly like that anyway, that kind of resonates with them because they know that uncertainty is just part of life in general. So I don't know why it's a sham for us to think that uncertainty is not going to be part of the faith aspect of life as well. It always has been. I mean, Job's in the canon for a reason. The Ecclesiastes is in the canon for a reason. Lament Psalms are in the canon for a reason. There are many, those texts, what they proclaim very loudly is that part of the faith experience is not getting answers to the questions that you ask. Just on a personal level, I don't trust people who say they don't doubt. I mean, there are a lot of kind of apologists and stuff like that. They're 100% certain this definitely happened. And I'm like, you are? Like people, like in the ancient world, people didn't come back to life any more regularly they do in our world. It was a crazy, claiming that Jesus was resurrected, it was crazy then, and the people who proclaimed it knew it was crazy when they were proclaiming it. I just had this conversation with a friend of mine who wanted to meet with me. He said, I've wondered really what you think about this. I said, of course, it's a crazy statement. If you don't think it was a crazy statement, I don't think you understand what they're actually claiming. It's only natural that you'd sit back and say, well, I have questions about some of these. And if somebody doesn't have any questions at all about that, I don't know. I wouldn't let them do my taxes.